When the anxious calls it quits with the avoidant, it is often the culmination of a long and invisible struggle that nobody warns you about. The anxious person has spent countless moments reaching out, seeking reassurance, craving presence, and trying to create a sense of security that the avoidant cannot consistently provide. From the outside, it may appear as though they are overly sensitive or demanding, but in reality, they are responding to a deep need for connection that has always been part of their inner world. The avoidant, on the other hand, has spent just as much energy protecting themselves, maintaining space, and avoiding being overwhelmed by feelings that feel too intense. Each interaction between them becomes a subtle dance of approach and withdrawal, a push and pull that is not consciously chosen but emerges naturally from their internal patterns. What nobody warns you about is that this dynamic is emotionally exhausting for both parties. The anxious feels perpetually unseen, while the avoidant feels perpetually pressured, and over time this imbalance builds an invisible wall that becomes harder to dismantle. When the anxious finally reaches a breaking point, it is not out of anger but out of self-preservation, realizing that chasing someone who cannot meet them halfway slowly erodes their sense of self-worth. This decision to step away is rarely sudden. It is the result of long periods of emotional labor, nights spent analyzing conversations, and internal debates about whether their needs are too much or if they are misreading the situation. The anxious begins to notice the pattern. Every attempt to bridge the gap is met with retreat, and each moment of closeness is followed by distance. Slowly, they recognize that their energy is being spent maintaining a connection that may never be fully reciprocal. This awareness can be painful, as it often clashes with the deep love or attachment they feel. Yet there is also a strange clarity that comes with this realization. The anxious starts to understand that leaving is not failure. It is an act of courage. They are choosing their own emotional survival over the endless cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. Nobody warns you that this clarity is accompanied by grief, because leaving someone who feels familiar, even if they are harmful in subtle ways, means confronting the fear of being alone, which has haunted them for years. For the avoidant, this moment is equally complex but less visible. They may not understand why the anxious has left, or why the usual pattern of pursuit has stopped. In their mind, distance has always been safety, yet the absence of pursuit now feels like emptiness. They may experience a delayed sense of loss, a quiet realization that the connection they once unconsciously relied on for comfort and validation is no longer available. Nobody warns you that avoidants often feel regret in a way that is internalized and confusing. They may not express it outwardly, yet it stirs a subtle unrest that challenges their habitual detachment. This is the paradox of their dynamic. The very boundaries they set to protect themselves create the conditions for absence and eventual separation. The anxious leaves to reclaim their emotional autonomy, while the avoidant faces the consequences of having never fully allowed intimacy to take root. In this complex interplay, both individuals are forced to confront shadows within themselves: fear of abandonment for the anxious, fear of engulfment for the avoidant, shadows that have shaped their relational patterns for years and will continue to influence their approach to love and connection in the future. The anxious calling it quits with the avoidant is not just a relational event. It is a profound psychological shift that forces both individuals to confront patterns they have long ignored. For the anxious, the decision emerges from a persistent sense of imbalance, a growing awareness that their emotional efforts are not being met with equal receptivity. They have spent so long navigating the unpredictable tides of closeness and distance that exhaustion becomes inevitable. Each attempt to reach out, to create intimacy, to receive validation, has been met with withdrawal, leaving the anxious feeling unseen and misunderstood despite their persistence. This pattern triggers old wounds, often rooted in early experiences of inconsistency or neglect, and the emotional toll accumulates silently over time. Nobody warns you that this dynamic, while subtle, can shape one's sense of self, eroding confidence and trust in one's ability to be understood or valued. The anxious realizes that their energy has been spent in a way that perpetuates stress rather than growth, and the act of stepping away becomes less about ending a relationship and more about reclaiming agency over one's emotional life. This step requires courage, for it means breaking a pattern that has become familiar, even if it is painful, and entering a space of uncertainty where self-care must take precedence over familiar relational scripts. For the avoidant, the departure of the anxious can provoke confusion and discomfort that is difficult to articulate. Avoidants have developed strategies to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm, often keeping feelings at a distance to maintain a sense of control and stability. When the anxious finally disengages, the usual cycle of pursuit that once validated their boundaries disappears, leaving them in a state of unanticipated emptiness. This absence challenges the protective mechanisms they have relied upon, revealing how much they have relied on the anxious for subtle affirmation without consciously acknowledging it. Nobody warns you that avoidance may feel a delayed grief, one that is internalized and often expressed as irritability, restlessness, or a vague sense of incompleteness, rather than overt emotional expression. The withdrawal of the anxious becomes a mirror, reflecting the avoidant's fear of intimacy and the cost of maintaining distance at the expense of deeper connection. In this space, the avoidant is confronted with the paradox of their relational style. The very walls built for safety have contributed to the rupture, and now they must face an absence that questions the adequacy of their protective strategies. Both parties, in this moment of separation, are invited into profound self-reflection. The anxious learns the value of self-soothing and building internal security rather than seeking constant external reassurance. They are challenged to confront their attachment fears and consider how patterns of pursuit have influenced their choices. The avoidant, meanwhile, encounters the hidden costs of emotional avoidance, gaining the opportunity to explore vulnerability without feeling threatened. Nobody warns you that these separations, though painful, carry the potential for personal evolution, revealing the unconscious patterns that have long dictated relational behavior. This is not a story of blame or failure, but of initiation into self-awareness. In this quiet tension, each person confronts inner shadows, the anxious facing abandonment fears and the avoidant facing intimacy fears, and the departure becomes a crucible in which new understanding and emotional maturity can emerge. When the anxious decides to walk away from the avoidant, the act is often misunderstood as impulsive or reactionary, but it is rarely so. It is the result of accumulated emotional strain, the quiet erosion of patience, and the repeated experience of unmet needs. The anxious has lived in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for signals of closeness and reassurance that are inconsistent at best. Every withdrawal by the avoidant reinforces a subconscious narrative of insufficiency, and over time, the anxious begins to internalize a sense of failure, believing that their desire for connection is somehow flawed or excessive. This internal dialogue is silent yet relentless, quietly shaping behaviors and expectations in ways that perpetuate anxiety. Nobody warns you that this prolonged engagement with inconsistency does not simply create frustration. It begins to alter one's sense of self, making each individual doubt their worthiness of care and attention. The act of leaving, then, becomes less about rejecting the other person and more about reclaiming a sense of personal integrity and emotional sovereignty. In stepping away, the anxious is attempting to break free from a cycle that has been unconsciously familiar yet deeply draining, choosing to honor their own needs instead of continually prioritizing the avoidant's comfort over their own well-being. For the avoidant, the departure of the anxious can feel like a sudden and disorienting shift. Avoidants often navigate relationships with a keen awareness of boundaries and a careful avoidance of emotional entanglement, believing that distance is a form of protection. When the anxious disengages, the predictable rhythm of pursuit and retreat is disrupted, leaving the avoidant in a space of unfamiliar absence. Nobody warns you that avoidants may experience a delayed, almost imperceptible sense of grief, one that is not always recognizable even to themselves. The silence of the anxious exposes a gap in the avoidant's inner life, revealing how much they have relied on the presence of the other to validate their own strategies of emotional distance. This absence challenges the avoidant's long-held assumptions about autonomy and safety, forcing them to consider the subtle costs of emotional withdrawal. In many cases, this is a moment of unspoken reckoning. The very walls built to preserve independence now highlight what has been lost when intimacy was consistently avoided. The avoidant may not openly express regret or sorrow, yet internally, a tension emerges that questions the adequacy of their protective strategies and prompts reflection on the possibility of deeper relational engagement. The separation also becomes an opportunity for the anxious to engage in self-discovery. Freed from the constant cycle of pursuing reassurance, they begin to observe the ways their own emotional patterns have shaped their interactions. This is a moment to develop internal resources, cultivate self-trust, and confront fears of abandonment without relying on external validation. Simultaneously, the avoidant is confronted with the unseen effects of their withdrawal, offering a chance to recognize that emotional presence need not be a threat. Nobody warns you that this period of absence, though painful, carries immense potential for growth. Each party is invited to face the shadows of fear and avoidance that have governed their relational lives, transforming a painful ending into a crucible for self-awareness, emotional maturity, and the possibility of healthier connections in the future. When the anxious ends the relationship with the avoidant, it often marks the culmination of an invisible struggle that neither party fully acknowledges while it is happening. The anxious has spent countless moments navigating uncertainty, trying to bridge a gap that feels both familiar and unsteady. Every attempt to draw the avoidant closer is met with subtle retreat, creating a pattern that slowly erodes patience and emotional energy. What makes this separation particularly profound is that it is rarely about dramatic conflict. It is about exhaustion. The anxious experiences an internal tension between their deep desire for connection and the repeated experience of distance. Over time, this creates a quiet but persistent sense of inadequacy, as if their need for closeness is a flaw. Nobody warns you that this type of emotional fatigue can be more damaging than overt arguments because it chips away at self-esteem and fosters self-doubt. When the anxious finally chooses to step away, it is an act of self-preservation. It is the conscious recognition that continuing to invest in a pattern that does not meet their emotional needs will only perpetuate pain and insecurity. In this decision, there is courage, clarity, and the beginning of reclaiming autonomy over one's emotional life, even if the space left behind is filled with uncertainty. For the avoidant, the departure is a subtle shock. Avoidants often operate under the assumption that distance is protective, believing that their emotional boundaries safeguard them from vulnerability and discomfort. When the anxious disengages, the usual rhythm of pursuit and withdrawal that has unconsciously structured their interactions is broken. Nobody warns you that this absence can provoke an unexpected sense of loss or emptiness in the avoidant, even if they do not immediately recognize it. The quiet departure forces them to confront the unseen consequences of their withdrawal, revealing how much they relied on the anxious for emotional validation without consciously acknowledging it. The avoidant may feel unsettled, confused, or even restless as they navigate this unfamiliar space. It is a moment that challenges long-held assumptions about independence, illustrating that avoidance can create distance at the cost of meaningful connection. In the silence left by the anxious, the avoidant encounters the subtle tension between self-protection and the hidden need for intimacy. This confrontation is often internal and unspoken, yet it is essential for any potential growth in future relationships. The separation ultimately becomes an opportunity for profound reflection for both individuals. The anxious can begin to cultivate internal security, developing the ability to soothe themselves and confront fears of abandonment without relying on external reassurance. The avoidant, meanwhile, is presented with the chance to examine how emotional withdrawal has shaped relational dynamics and to explore the possibility that vulnerability is not inherently threatening. Nobody warns you that these periods of absence, though uncomfortable and even painful, carry the potential for significant personal evolution. Each individual is invited to confront deep-seated patterns and fears, transforming what feels like an ending into a space for self-awareness, growth, and the preparation for more balanced, conscious connections in the future. When the anxious chooses to end the relationship with the avoidant, it is often the result of repeated cycles that have quietly exhausted their emotional reserves. The anxious has spent much of the relationship reaching out, seeking reassurance, and trying to maintain closeness in a dynamic that is inherently inconsistent. Each attempt to connect is met with subtle withdrawal, creating a rhythm of pursuit and retreat that becomes exhausting over time. What makes this process especially challenging is that it is rarely dramatic. The avoidant does not reject with harsh words or open conflict. They simply step back in ways that feel small but cumulative, leaving the anxious perpetually questioning their own worth and the stability of the relationship. Nobody warns you that this dynamic can gradually erode self-confidence, making it difficult for the anxious to separate the behavior of the other from their own sense of value. The decision to leave is not impulsive. It is a thoughtful acknowledgement that continued emotional labor in an imbalanced relationship cannot sustain well-being. In stepping away, the anxious is asserting their need for respect, reciprocity, and consistency, recognizing that self-preservation must come before maintaining a pattern that no longer supports growth or security. For the avoidant, the departure can feel both confusing and disorienting. Avoidants have learned to manage relationships with careful boundaries, often keeping their emotions at a distance to avoid feeling overwhelmed. When the anxious finally disengages, the predictable pattern of pursuit that has validated their protective boundaries disappears, leaving a void that can be surprisingly unsettling. Nobody warns you that avoidance may experience a delayed or subtle sense of loss that is difficult to articulate. The absence of the anxious reflects the cost of emotional avoidance, revealing that protection through distance can also create loneliness and missed connection. Avoidance may feel discomfort, restlessness, or a vague sense of incompleteness, challenging their long-held assumptions that autonomy alone ensures safety. This moment, while quiet, becomes a mirror reflecting the limitations of avoidance. The very strategies that once provided security now underscore what has been sacrificed, the potential for closeness, understanding, and shared emotional depth. The avoidant must confront the consequences of their habitual withdrawal, even if they do so internally, without overtly expressing regret. For both parties, the separation presents a critical opportunity for reflection and personal growth. The anxious can learn to cultivate internal security and self-soothing, confronting attachment fears without relying on external validation. The avoidant can recognize the unseen impact of emotional withdrawal and explore the possibility that vulnerability does not have to be threatening. Nobody warns you that these moments of absence, though painful, are fertile ground for self-awareness and transformation. In this space, each individual is invited to examine long-standing patterns, confront deep-seated fears, and consider how their relational behaviors have shaped the dynamic. The separation is not solely an ending, but also an initiation into greater emotional maturity. Through this process, both anxious and avoidant have the potential to develop a more conscious, balanced, and authentic approach to connection in future relationships, transforming a painful rupture into a source of lasting insight and personal evolution. When the anxious decides to end things with the avoidant, it is often an act of quiet courage that goes unnoticed by the world. This decision does not come from anger or impulsivity. It comes from deep awareness that the patterns in the relationship have become emotionally unsustainable. The anxious has spent months, sometimes years, seeking closeness, reassurance, and emotional presence, only to find that these efforts are inconsistently met. Every attempt to connect, to feel secure, to create a shared emotional space is met with withdrawal, distance, or subtle avoidance. Over time, the anxious begins to notice a painful truth. Their energy is invested more in maintaining the relationship than in nurturing their own sense of self. Nobody warns you that this quiet depletion of emotional resources can be as damaging as overt conflict, slowly shaping self-perception and fostering doubts about worthiness. Choosing to leave is therefore an act of self-preservation, a decision to reclaim autonomy and protect the inner life from patterns that repeatedly reinforce anxiety. It is an acknowledgement that love alone cannot fix a dynamic built on avoidance and fear, and that leaving may be the first step toward emotional clarity and healing. For the avoidant, the separation is often a subtle shock because the usual rhythm of the relationship is disrupted. Avoidants have long maintained distance as a means of self-protection, believing that emotional space safeguards them from vulnerability and overwhelm. When the anxious finally disengages, the predictable cycle of pursuit and retreat ends, leaving a void that can feel disorienting. Nobody warns you that avoidants may experience a delayed sense of loss or emptiness, often without recognizing it consciously. The absence of pursuit forces them to confront the hidden consequences of their withdrawal, revealing how their strategies to preserve independence may have contributed to the rupture. While they may not express regret outwardly, a quiet tension or restlessness emerges, highlighting the cost of avoidance, missed opportunities for intimacy, understanding, and shared emotional depth. In this moment, the avoidant is invited to examine how protective walls may have prevented meaningful connection, learning that vulnerability, though uncomfortable, is essential for authentic relationships. The separation offers both individuals a space for self-reflection and growth. The anxious, free from constant emotional chasing, can focus on developing self-reliance, self-soothing, and inner security. The avoidant has the opportunity to reflect on the subtle effects of emotional distance, considering how openness and vulnerability might enhance future connections. Nobody warns you that this absence, though painful, is fertile ground for transformation, allowing each person to confront deeply ingrained patterns and fears. This process transforms an ending into a space of self-awareness, offering the potential for more conscious, balanced, and emotionally mature relationships in the future. Through this journey, both anxious and avoidant learn not just about each other, but about themselves, turning a painful separation into a catalyst for personal evolution. When the anxious finally decides to walk away from the avoidant, it is rarely a decision made lightly or in haste. It is the result of long-term observation of the patterns that have quietly shaped the relationship and the recognition that these patterns are no longer sustainable. The anxious has spent countless moments reaching for reassurance, seeking emotional presence, and hoping for a consistency that never fully materialized. Each attempt to bridge the emotional gap is met with subtle retreat, creating a cycle where pursuit and withdrawal alternate in a rhythm that slowly drains vitality and confidence. Over time, the anxious begins to feel as though their need for connection is a flaw rather than a natural aspect of human relational life. Nobody warns you that the accumulation of this emotional fatigue can erode self-esteem and shape the inner narrative in ways that make leaving both terrifying and necessary. Choosing to exit is a profound act of self-preservation, a conscious acknowledgement that investing in a dynamic that consistently leaves one feeling unseen is not a sustainable path. In this departure, the anxious is reclaiming agency over their own emotional life, asserting that their needs and well-being must take precedence over a pattern that perpetually reinforces insecurity and tension. For the avoidant, the anxious leaving can be disorienting in ways that are subtle yet profound. Avoidants have developed strategies to maintain distance and protect themselves from emotional overwhelm, often seeing withdrawal as a necessary means of self-preservation. When the anxious disengages, the familiar pattern of pursuit that previously validated boundaries disappears, leaving an unanticipated void. Nobody warns you that avoidants may experience delayed grief or restlessness, often without consciously recognizing it. The absence of the anxious reveals the hidden cost of emotional avoidance, highlighting the ways their protective strategies may have inadvertently contributed to the rupture. While avoidants may not express regret overtly, an internal tension arises as they confront the limitations of their habitual withdrawal. The space left behind illuminates what was lost, the potential for deep emotional intimacy, shared understanding, and authentic connection. This moment invites reflection, challenging the avoidant to consider that vulnerability, though uncomfortable, is essential for the growth of any meaningful relationship. This separation becomes an opportunity for both parties to engage in reflection and self-discovery. The anxious can begin to develop self-soothing techniques, cultivate inner security, and confront fears of abandonment without relying on the presence or approval of another. The avoidant is offered the chance to explore the subtle consequences of consistent withdrawal, and consider that emotional openness can be a source of strength rather than threat. Nobody warns you that these periods of absence, while uncomfortable and even painful, can be fertile ground for personal evolution. In this space, both individuals face the patterns and fears that have long governed their relational behaviors. The ending becomes a crucible for growth, offering a path toward more conscious, balanced, and emotionally mature approaches to connection in the future, transforming what initially feels like loss into a powerful catalyst for self-awareness and transformation.